Hello, friends. It's March 24th. It's a Monday night. And for many years now, I've wanted to do an adult story time. And it feels like now is the time. So I poked around in my parents' basement. I thought I should probably find something that doesn't have copyright. And because of my grandmother's British chauvinistic teacher roots, my parents have tons of dead white guys down there. And I grabbed two of them. One was Charles Dickens, Nicholas Nickleby, and the other is Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago. So a couple of you commented that you would like to go with Dr. Zhivago. So Dr. Zhivago it is. I'm not doing it. I've never read it. I've never seen the movie. And I think it's going to be fun. I hope to kind of figure out a way to post this fairly regularly. And yeah, we've got some time on our hands. We're going to work our way through this book. So, Dr. Zhivago by Russian novelist Boris Pasternak. Oh, and look at this. I just reached inside. I don't know if you can see that. Charney Porcel, are you watching? Okay. This book clearly at some point belonged to our neighbor, Joyce Porcelt. Thank you, Joyce. Dr. Zhivago, translated from the Russian by Max Hayward and Manya Harari, and it was published in London in 1958. Here we go. Oh no, that's translator's note. Okay. Oh man, there's so many principal characters. Look at them all. That's a lot. Well, we will learn to keep them all straight together. Are you ready? This is probably the right time to take a sip of water. I'm just at home. I'm just in my bed. It's snowy outside. Chapter 1, The 5 O'Clock Express. On they went, singing eternal memory, and whenever they stopped, the sound of their feet, the horses and the gusts of wind, seemed to carry on their singing. Passers-by made way for the procession, counted the wreaths, and crossed themselves. Some joined in out of curiosity and asked, "Who is being buried?" "Zhivago," they were told. "Oh, I see. That explains it. It isn't him. It's his wife." "Well, it comes to the same thing. May she rest in peace. It's a fine funeral." The last moments flashed past, counted irrevocable. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the earth and everything that dwells therein. The priest scattered earth in the form of a cross over the body of Maria Nikolaevna. They sang the souls of the just. Then a fearful bustle began. The coffin was closed, nailed, and lowered into the ground. Clods of earth drummed on the lid like rain as the grave was filled hurriedly by 4 spades. A mound grew up on it, and a 10-year-old boy climbed on top. Only the numb and unfeeling condition which comes to people at the end of a big funeral could account for some of the mourners thinking that he wished to make an address over his mother's grave. He raised his head, and from his vantage point absently surveyed the bare autumn landscape and the domes of the monastery. His snub-nosed face was contorted. He stretched out his neck. If a wolf cub had done this, it would have been obvious that it was about to howl. The boy covered his face with his hands and burst into sobs. The wind bearing down on him lashed his hands and face with cold gusts of rain. A man in black with tightly fitted sleeves went up to the grave. This was Nikolai Nikolaevich Vedenyapin, the dead woman's brother and the uncle of the weeping boy. He was a priest who had been unfrocked at his own request. He went up to the boy and led him out of the graveyard. They spent the night at the monastery where Uncle Kolya was given a room for old time's sake. It was the eve of the feast of intercession of the Holy Virgin. The next day they were supposed to travel south to a provincial town on the Volga, where Uncle Kolya worked for a publisher who produced the local progressive newspaper. They had already bought their tickets and their things stood packed in the cell. The plaintive hooting of engines shunting in the distance was carried by the wind from the neighboring railway. It got very cold in the evening. The 2 windows of the cell were at ground level and looked out on a corner of the neglected kitchen garden, a stretch of the main road with frozen puddles on it, and the part of the churchyard where Maria Nikolaevna had been buried earlier in the day. There was nothing in the kitchen garden except acacia bushes around the walls and a few beds of cabbages, wrinkled and blue with cold. With each blast of wind, the leafless acacias danced as if possessed and flattened themselves against the path. During the night, the boy, Yura, was woken up by a knocking at the window. The dark cell was mysteriously lit up by a flickering whiteness. With nothing on but his shirt, he ran to the window and pressed his face against the cold glass. Outside there was no trace of the road, the graveyard, or the kitchen garden. Nothing but the blizzard, the air smoking with snow. It was almost as if the snowstorm had caught sight of Yura and, conscious of its power to terrify, roared, howled, and did everything possible to attract his attention, reveling in the effect it had on him. Turning over and over in the sky, length after length of whiteness unwound over the earth and shrouded it. The blizzard was alone on earth and knew no rival. When he climbed down from the windowsill, Yura's first impulse was to dress, run outside, and start doing something. He was afraid that the cabbage patch would be buried so that no one could dig it up, and that his mother, buried in the open field, would helplessly sink deeper and deeper away from him into the ground. Once more it ended in tears. His uncle woke up, spoke to him of Christ, and tried to comfort him, then yawned and stood thoughtfully by the window. They started to dress. It was getting light. While his mother was alive, Yura did not know that his father had abandoned them long ago and spent his time wenching and carousing in Siberia and abroad, nor that he had blown the family millions to the four winds. He was always told that his father was away on business in Petersburg or at one of the big fairs, usually at Irbit. When his mother, who had never been strong, developed consumption, she took to going to southern France and northern Italy for treatment. Yura went with her on 2 of these journeys. He was often left with strangers and often passed on from one to another. He became accustomed to all these changes, and against this untidy background, surrounded with continual mysteries, he was not surprised at his father's absence. He could remember a time in his early childhood when an infinite variety of objects were still known by his surname. There were Zhivago factories, a Zhivago bank, Zhivago buildings, a Zhivago tie pin, even a cake rather like a baba o rum, known as Zhivago bun, and at one time you only had to say to your sleigh driver in Moscow, Zhivagos, and rather as if you had said, "Take me to Timbuktu," he carried you off in his sleigh to an enchanted kingdom at the end of the world. The park closed round you as quiet as a countryside. Crows scattered the hoarfrost as they settled on the heavy branches of the firs. Their cawing echoed like cracking wood. Pedigree dogs came running across the road out of the clearing where building was going on and where lights shone in the gathering dusk. Suddenly it all vanished. They became poor. One day in summer 1903, 2 years after his mother's death, Yura was driving across fields in a 2-horse open carriage with his uncle Kolya. They were on their way to see Ivan Ivanovich Voskoboynikov, a teacher and a writer of popular textbooks who lived at Dupolyanka, the estate of Kolo Grivov, a silk manufacturer and a great patron of the arts. It was the feast of the Virgin of Kazan. The harvest was in full swing, but whether because of the feast or because of the midday break, there was not a soul in sight. The half-reaped fields scorched in the sun like the half-shorn heads of convicts. Birds circled overhead. The ripe wheat stood straight up in the perfect stillness. At a distance from the road, stooks rose above the stubble, and if you stared at them long enough, seemed to move, like land surveyors walking about on the skyline taking notes. "Are these landlords' or peasants' fields?" Nikolai Nikolaevich asked Pavel, the publisher's odd-job man who sat sideways on the box, shoulders hunched and legs crossed to show that driving was not his regular job. "These are the masters." Pavel lit his pipe, drew on it, and after a long silence, jabbed with the end of his whip in another direction. "And those are ours. Get on with you," he shouted at the horses, whose tails and haunches he watched like an engine driver's instrument panel. But the horses were like horses all the world over. The shaft horse, pulling with the innate honesty of a simple soul, while the off-horse arched its neck like a swan and seemed to the uninitiated to be an inveterate idler who thought of nothing but prancing in time to the jangling of its bell. Nikolai Nikolaevich had with him the proofs of Voskoboynikov's book on the land question. The publishers had asked the author to revise it in view of the increasingly strict censorship. "People are getting pretty rough here," he told Pavel. "A merchant has had his throat slit, and the stud farm of the Zemsky has been burned down. What do you think of it all? What are they saying in your village?" But evidently Pavel took an even gloomier view than the censor, who wished Voskoboynikov to moderate the passionate strength of his views on the agrarian problem. "What do you expect them to say? The peasants have got out of hand. They've been treated too well. That's no good for the likes of us. Give the peasants rope and God knows we'll all be at each other's throats in no time. Get a move on there." This was Yura's second trip with his uncle to Dublanka. He thought he knew the way, and every time when the field ran out on either side, with a thin line of forest in front and behind, he expected the road to turn right and give a fleeting view of the Kologrivov place, with its 10-mile stretch of open country, the river gleaming in the distance, and the railway beyond it. But each time he was mistaken. Field followed field, and was in turn swallowed by forests. The succession of huge views aroused in the travelers a feeling of spaciousness, and made them think and dream of the future. The books which later made Nikolai Nikolaevich famous were still unwritten, but his ideas had already taken shape. Yet he did not know that his hour was close at hand. Soon he was to take his place among the writers of his time, university professors and philosophers of the revolutionary movement, as one who, though he shared their preoccupations, had nothing in common with their way of thinking except its terminology. All of them, without exception, clung to this or that dogma, and were satisfied with words and outward appearances. But he, Father Nikolai, a priest, had been both a Tolstoyan and a revolutionary idealist, and was still traveling on. He craved for an idea, inspired yet concrete, that would show a clear path and change the world for the better, an idea as unmistakable even to a child or an ignorant fool as lightning or a roll of thunder. He craved for something new. Yura liked being with his uncle. He reminded him of his mother. Like hers, his mind moved with freedom and welcomed the unfamiliar. He had the same aristocratic sense of equality with all living things, and the same gift of taking in everything at a glance, and of expressing his thoughts as they first came to him, and before they had lost their meaning and vitality. Yura was glad that his uncle was taking him to Dublanka. It was a beautiful place, and this too reminded him of his mother, who had been fond of nature and had often taken him for country walks. He also looked forward to seeing Nicky Dudorov again, though Nicky, being 2 years older, probably despised him. Nicky was a schoolboy who lived at the Voskoboynikovs, and who, when he shook hands with Yura, jerked his arm downwards with all his might, and bowed his head so low that his hair flopped over his forehead and hid half his face. How are you doing? We'll do a few more pages here, I think. The vital nerve of the problem is poverty. Nikolai Nikolaevich read from the revised manuscript. Essence would be better, I think, said Ivan Ivanovich, making the correction on the galleys. They were working in the half-darkness of the covered veranda. Watering cans and gardening tools lay about. A raincoat had been flung over the back of a broken chair, and waders cracked with mud. Their tops, dropping to the floor, stood in a corner. On the other hand, the statistics of births and deaths show, dictated Nikolai Nikolaevich. Insert for the year under review, said Ivan Ivanovich, and made a note. There was a slight draft. Lumps of granite lay on the sheets as paperweights. When they finished, Nikolai Nikolaevich wanted to leave at once. There's a storm coming. We must be off. Nothing of the sort. I won't let you. We're going to have tea now. But I must be back in town by evening. It's no use arguing. I won't hear of it. Tea was being laid in the garden. A whiff of charcoal smoke from the samovar drifted in, smothering the smell of tobacco and heliotrope. A maid carried out a tray with clotted cream, berries, and cheesecakes. It was learned that Pavel had gone off to bathe in the river and had taken the horses with him. Nikolai Nikolaevich had no choice but to submit and stay. "Let's go down to the river while they're getting tea ready," suggested Ivan Ivanovitch. On the strength of his friendship with Kologrevov, he had the use of his 2 rooms in the manager's house. The lodge with its own small garden stood in a neglected corner of the park, near the old drive, now thickly overgrown with grass and no longer used except for carting rubbish to the gully which served as a refuse dump. Kologrevov, a man of advanced views and a millionaire who sympathized with the revolution, was abroad with his wife. Only his 2 daughters, Nadia and Lipa, with their governess and a small staff of servants, were living on the estate. A thick hedge of black thorn separated the manager's lodge and garden from the park, with its lawns and artificial lakes which surrounded the house. As Ivan Ivanovitch and Nikolai Nikolaevich skirted the hedge, sparrows flew out of it in front of them at regular intervals in small flocks of equal size. The blackthorn swarmed with them, and they filled it with an even chatter like water flowing in a pipe. They passed the hothouses, the gardener's cottage, and some stone ruins of obscure origin. They were talking about new talent in the world of letters and scholarship. "Of course one does meet brilliant men," said Nikolai Nikolaevich, "but they are isolated. The fashion nowadays is all for groups and societies of every sort. It is always a sign of mediocrity in people when they herd together, whether their group loyalty is to Soloviev or to Kant or Marx. The truth is only sought by individuals, and they break with those who do not love it enough. How many things in the world deserve our loyalty? Very few indeed. I think one should be loyal to immortality, which is another word for life, a stronger word for it. One must be true to immortality, true to Christ. But you're frowning, my poor man. As usual, you haven't understood a word." Said Ivan Ivanovitch. He was a thin, fair-haired man, restless as an eel and with a wicked little beard, which made him look like an American of Lincoln's time. He was always bunching it up in his hand, and nibbling the tip. "I say nothing, of course. As you know, I look at these things rather differently. But while we're at it, tell me, what was it like when they unfrocked you? I bet you were scared. Didn't they anathematize you?" "You're trying to change the subject. However, why not? No, I wasn't anathematized. Cursing isn't done nowadays. There was a certain amount of unpleasantness, and there are certain consequences. For instance, I am banned from the civil service for quite a long time, and I am forbidden to go to Moscow or Petersburg. But these are trifles. As I was saying, one must be true to Christ. I'll explain. What you don't understand is that it is possible to be an atheist. It is possible not to know God. It is possible not to know if God exists or why he should, and yet to believe that man does not live in a state of nature, but in history, and that history as we know it now began with Christ. It was founded by him on the Gospels. Now what is history? Its beginning is that of the centuries of systematic work devoted to the solution of the enigma of death, so that death itself may eventually be overcome. This is why people write symphonies and why they discover mathematical infinity and electromagnetic waves. Now you can't advance in that direction without a certain upsurge of spirit. You can't make such discoveries without spiritual equipment, and for this, everything necessary has been given us in the Gospels. What is it? Firstly, the love of one's neighbor, the supreme form of living energy. Once it fills the heart of a man, it has to overflow and spend itself. And secondly, the 2 concepts which are the main part of the makeup of modern man, without them he is inconceivable, the ideas of free personality and of life regarded as a sacrifice. Mind you, all this is still quite new. There was no history in this sense in the classical world. There you had blood and beastliness and cruelty and pockmarked Caligulas, untouched by the suspicion that any man who enslaves others is inevitably second-rate. There you had the boastful, dead eternity of bronze monuments and marble columns. It was not until after the coming of Christ that time and man could breathe freely. It was not until after him that men began to live in their posterity and ceased to die in ditches like dogs. Instead, they died at home, in history, at the height of the work they devoted to the conquest of death, being themselves dedicated to this aim. Oof, I'm sweating like a pig. I might as well be talking to a blank wall. That's metaphysics, my dear fellow. It's forbidden me by my doctors. My stomach won't take it. Oh, well, you're hopeless. Let's leave it. Goodness, what of you, you lucky devil? Though I suppose you live with it every day, you don't see it. The river blazed in the sun, hurting the eyes. It shimmered, bending and unbending like sheet metal. Suddenly its surface creased. A big ferry loaded with carts, horses, and peasants, and their women, started for the other shore. Fancy, it's only just gone 5, said Ivan Ivanovitch. There's the express from Sizran. It comes through here at 5:05. Far out on the plain, crossing it from right to left, came a neat little yellow and blue train, made tiny by the distance. Suddenly they noticed that it stopped. White puffs of steam flurried over the engine, and a moment later they heard its alarmed hooting. That's strange, said Voskoboynikov. Something's wrong. It has no business to stop in the middle of the marsh out there. Something must have happened. Let's go and have tea. Nicky was not to be found either in the house or in the garden. Yura, left to wander aimlessly round the house while his uncle and Ivan Ivanovitch worked on the veranda, guessed that he was in hiding because guests bored him, and Yura was not his equal. It was a wonderful place. Every other minute a yellow thrush made its 3-note call, followed by a pause to let the whole of the clear, moist, fluting tune sink and soak into the countryside. Flower smells, caught and dazed by the stagnant air, stood in still shafts over the beds, transfixed by the heat. How much it reminded him of Antibes and of Bordighera. He kept turning to right and left. Like an oral hallucination, his mother's voice haunted the lawns. It was in the buzzing of the bees and the musical phrases of the birds. It made him quiver with the illusion that she was expecting him to answer, that she was calling him to her, now here, now there. He walked towards the gully and climbed through the clean coppices overhanging its edges. He walked towards the gully and climbed through the clean coppice overhanging its edge into the tangled alder thicket at the bottom. Down there, among the litter of fallen branches, it was dark and dank. Flowers were few, and the knotted stalks of mare's tail looked like the Egyptian scepters in his illustrated Bible. Yura felt more and more depressed. He felt like crying. He slumped to his knees and burst into tears. Angel of God, my holy guardian, Yura prayed, confirm me in the way of truth and tell Mama I'm all right, she's not to worry. If there is a life after death, O Lord, receive her into thy heavenly mansions, where the faces of the saints and of the just shine like lamps. Mama was so good, she couldn't have been a sinner. Have mercy on her, Lord, and please don't let her suffer. Mama, in his heart-rending anguish, he called her down from heaven like a newly canonized saint, and suddenly, unable to bear any more, fell down in a faint. He was not unconscious for long. When he came to himself, he heard his uncle calling from above. He answered and started climbing out of the gully. Suddenly he remembered that he had not prayed for his missing father, as his mother had taught him to do. But his fainting fit had left him with such a sense of lightness and well-being that he was unwilling to risk losing it, and it occurred to him that nothing much would happen if he prayed for his father another time. He can wait, he almost thought. Yura did not remember him at all. We're going to stop there. We're on page 21. We're on the 7th section of chapter 1, and this has been fun. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.